Stay with this story until the very end, because what Harlan Boyce found inside that old Steinway was about to cost Reginald Hartwell everything he thought he'd built his life on. Owen Calloway walked into Hartwell Fine Instruments on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the maples along Elgin Street had gone the color of rust, and the sidewalks were slick with the first real rain of the season. He was wearing his work jacket, the navy one with the frayed cuff he kept meaning to replace, and his hands, even freshly washed, carried the particular darkness that engine grease leaves behind in the creases of a man's knuckles. He had his daughter with him. She was 8 years old, and she was holding his hand, and she was wearing a yellow raincoat with a small duck on the pocket. Wait, I need to correct myself. The man who walked through that door was not Owen Calloway. His name was Harlan Boyce. And this is his story. Harlan Boyce was 41 years old. He worked as a machinist and mechanical restorer out of a shop he rented on the edge of Kanata, the kind of neighborhood where strip malls and warehouses sat next to each other without apology. He had grown up in New Brunswick, learned to fix things from his father, and moved to Ottawa when he was 26 for a job that turned into a life. He had been married. His wife, Claire, had died 4 years ago, a brain aneurysm, sudden and without warning, the way those things go. The doctors used the word catastrophic as if Harlan needed a word to understand what had happened to him. He had a daughter named June. No, wait, June is in the list. Let me be clear. Her name was Rosalind. 7 years old. She called herself Roz, and Harlan called her Roz, and that was the whole of it. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and she had recently decided, with the complete certainty of a 7-year-old, that she wanted to learn piano. Harlan didn't know anything about pianos. He knew carburetors and crankshafts, and the specific torque required to reseat a valve cover gasket without cracking it. He knew how old machines breathed and where they held their secrets. But, Plick knows, the mechanics of pianos were something else. So he did what any man in his position would do. He called a music teacher, a woman named Mrs. Okafor who taught out of her house on Meadowlands Drive, and asked her what kind of piano a beginner child needed and what it would cost. Mrs. Okafor told him a used upright was fine for learning. She told him the brand mattered less than the condition of the soundboard and the action of the keys. She gave him a checklist, things to look for, things to avoid, and she told him that a decent used instrument could be found for anywhere between $400 and $1,200. Harlan had $800 set aside. He'd been putting it away in $20 increments since July, the way he saved for everything now, carefully, slowly, with a kind of quiet discipline that nobody ever sees and nobody ever praises. He found Hartwell Fine Instruments through a search for piano dealers in Ottawa. The website looked serious. The photos showed gleaming grands and polished uprights arranged in a showroom that seemed more like a museum than a shop. There was a tab that said pre-owned, and Harlan clicked it and found 3 instruments listed, one of which was described as an antique upright, structural condition uncertain, offered as is for the right buyer. The price listed was $450. He called ahead. A man with a careful, smooth voice told him to come by. The shop was on Somerset West. Reginald Hartwell stood behind the counter when Harlan pushed open the door, and the bell above the door chimed a single clean note that hung in the air like a held breath. Hartwell was the kind of man who wore his age, late 50s, Harlan guessed, as though it were an achievement. His suit was charcoal gray and his hair was silver, and he looked at Harlan the way certain people look at a wrong answer. His gaze dropped briefly to Harlan's hands. It was a small thing. It lasted half a second. But Harlan had been looked at that way enough times in his life to know exactly what it meant. "You called earlier," Hartwell said. "It wasn't a question." "That's right. About the upright you have listed. The antique one." Roz had let go of Harlan's hand and was moving slowly along the wall, looking at the instruments the way she looked at things she wasn't sure she was allowed to touch. Hartwell watched her for a moment. "The Broadwood," Hartwell said. "Yes, I should be honest with you. It's not in playable condition. The soundboard has a crack, The action is frozen on about a third of the keys, and the cabinet has water damage along the bottom. We took it in on a clearance from an estate. I've had it in the back for 2 years. I doubt it can be restored economically." He said economically the way people say it when they mean by someone like you. "Can I see it?" Harlan asked. Hartwell led him through a door at the back of the showroom and into a storage space that smelled of old wood and damp felt. The piano sat against the far wall under a canvas tarp. Hartwell pulled the tarp back without ceremony, the way you'd reveal something you'd already decided was worthless. It was a Broadwood upright. Harlan had no frame of reference for Broadwood specifically, but he could see immediately that whatever it was very old. The case was rosewood, or something that had once been rosewood, now darkened, and lifting in places where moisture had gotten beneath the veneer. The legs were turned in a style that looked Victorian. The keyboard cover was stuck halfway open. One of the candlestick holders on the front panel had broken off at some point and been set on top of the case, sitting there like a small amputated limb. "The keys," Harlan said. He pressed one carefully. Nothing happened. "Frozen felt," Hartwell said, "like I said." Harlan crouched down and looked at the bottom of the case. The water damage was real. The wood had buckled along the base. He ran his hand along the side and felt the veneer shifting under his fingers, loose in places, the glue having given up its hold years ago. "The soundboard crack," he said. "Can I open the top?" Hartwell didn't answer, but he didn't stop him either. Harlan lifted the lid and looked inside. The soundboard was visible, and yes, there was a crack, running diagonally across the treble section, maybe 30 centimeters long. He looked at the pin block, he looked at the strings, he looked at the condition of the bridge. He was quiet for a long time. Roz appeared at his elbow. "Is it broken, Dad?" "It's tired," Harlan said. "That's different." Hartwell made a small sound, not quite a laugh. Harlan stood and turned back to the piano and looked at the front panel, the decorative woodwork between the keyboard and the top of the case. There was a carved cartouche in the center, typical of the period, with what looked like initials worked into the design. The light in the storage room was poor. He leaned in close. The initials were partially obscured by age and grime, but he could make out 2 of them. A C and what might have been a D. He didn't say anything about this to Hartwell. "How firm is the price?" he asked. $450, Hartwell said. "No guarantee, no returns. The moment it leaves here, it's yours." He paused. "Frankly, I'd take $400. I just want the floor space back." Harlan counted it out in cash. He had driven down in his truck, and he'd borrowed a furniture dolly from his neighbor. Getting the piano out took 40 minutes and the help of Hartwell's assistant, a young man who said nothing, but clearly felt the effort beneath his dignity. Hartwell stood in the doorway of the shop and watched the loading operation with his arms folded and a look on his face that Harlan had seen before. The look of a man who believes he has successfully moved a problem from his hands to someone else's. "Good luck," Hartwell said as Harlan climbed into the truck. He said it without warmth. Roz was in the passenger seat. She had been watching the whole thing quietly, the way she watched things she was trying to understand. "Do you like it?" she asked her father as the truck pulled away from the curb. Harlan kept his eyes on the road. "I think it might be interesting," he said. That night, after Roz was in bed, Harlan went back out to his shop where the piano now sat, not on the dolly anymore, but on the floor, covered with a moving blanket. He turned on the overhead light and pulled a stool over and sat in front of it. He opened his laptop and he began to read. He knew nothing about historical pianos, but he knew how to learn. He had been teaching himself the mechanics of things his entire adult life: combustion engines, hydraulic systems, industrial lathes, steam-era pumping equipment. The process was always the same. You started with what you could see. Then you found out what it meant. What he could see was this: a very old upright piano with a rosewood case, turned legs, a candlestick holder on the front panel, and a carved cartouche with the initials CD, or possibly CB, worked into the design. He started with the maker, Broadwood, John Broadwood and Sons, London. One of the oldest piano manufacturers in the world, he learned. dating back to the 18th century. Makers of instruments for Haydn, for Beethoven. The name alone suggested age, but age alone didn't mean rarity. He searched for images of antique Broadwood uprights. He compared the leg style, the cabinet proportions, the style of the front panel. Based on what he was seeing, this instrument appeared to date from the mid to late 1800s, possibly 1860s or 1870s. That made it genuinely old, but Harlan was cautious enough to know that old did not automatically mean valuable. He nearly closed the laptop, but the initials bothered him, not because of what they were, but because of where they were. The cartouche was positioned prominently, centrally, not the placement of a generic monogram added by a retailer, but something carved deliberately into the original commission. This was a custom instrument made for a specific person. You didn't commission a custom Broadwood if you weren't someone of means. He searched, Broadwood upright piano 1860s Canada commission monogram. He searched, Victorian-era piano Ottawa estate collection. He searched, CD, Victorian Canada notable figures. That last search, at midnight, led him somewhere unexpected. He was following a chain of links about the history of musical culture in 19th century Ottawa. When the city was still called Bytown in some accounts, when it was a young capital still figuring out what it meant to be one. And he came across a digitized collection of letters held by Library and Archives Canada. The collection was described as belonging to a Charlotte Drummond, 1838 to 1901, described in the finding aid as a significant figure in the early cultural and musical life of Ottawa's governing class, correspondent of several notable political and artistic figures of the Confederation era. Charlotte Drummond, C.D. Harlan sat very still for a moment. He kept reading. Charlotte Drummond had been the wife of a senator. She had been educated in England and had brought back with her, according to one of the digitized letters, a fine instrument from Broadwood's on Great Pulteney Street, which arrived in excellent condition despite the crossing. The letter was dated 1867. He was looking at the year his country had become a country. The piano in his shop, the one Reginald Hartwell had described as unrestorable, the one Hartwell had wanted off the floor for 2 years, the one Hartwell had sold him for $400 because he wanted the space back. That piano might have been in Canada since Confederation. Harlan didn't sleep that night, not because he was excited, though he was. He didn't sleep because he was a precise man and he had learned, in his years of working with machines, that hope and confirmation were different things, and that confusing them cost time and money and occasionally your dignity. He needed to know what he actually had before he let himself feel anything about it. The next morning he called Library and Archives Canada. He explained what he had found and what he was looking at, and a woman named, he later remembered her simply as the archivist, walked him through the finding aid for the Drummond collection. She confirmed that yes, the collection included references to a Broadwood piano. She told him that while they couldn't authenticate the instrument over the phone, there were specialists who could. He called a conservator in Toronto. He called the Rideau Valley Heritage Society. He sent photographs, careful, well-lit photographs taken with his phone, propped on a paint can at the precise angle needed to capture the cartouche, the leg style, the pin block markings, the soundboard inscription he found only after he removed the action panel, a serial number, stamped in ink that had faded to near invisibility, readable only under a flashlight at close range. The serial number, when submitted to the Broadwood Society in England, took 6 days to come back. The instrument was registered, built in 1866, commissioned by a private buyer through Broadwood's London showroom, shipped to Canada in 1867. The name of the original buyer on the commission record, Charlotte R. Drummond. He sat with that for a long time. He sat with it the way a man sits with something that changes the shape of a room. He wasn't a piano restorer. He was a machinist. He could assess mechanical condition. He could stabilize and disassemble and clean. But the acoustical restoration of a 19th century Broadwood was work that required a specialist. He called the conservator in Toronto again, a woman named Dr. Singh who had spent 30 years restoring historical keyboard instruments for museums and private collections, and he explained what he had. She was quiet on the phone for longer than he expected. If the soundboard crack is what you're describing and the pin block is in reasonable shape, she said, and if the provenance is what you're saying, you need to understand what you might be sitting on. What am I sitting on? Harlan asked. There are very few documented Confederation-era commissioned instruments left in Canada in any kind of restaurable condition, she said. Most were lost, sold for parts, destroyed in house fires, floods. The ones that have surfaced at auction in the past decade have sold, with documentation, for significant sums. One in 2019 went for just under $3 million, but that had an exceptional provenance. How exceptional? She paused. Less than yours, from what you're describing. He thought about Reginald Hartwell, about the way the man had looked at his hands, about the canvas tarp and the storage room, and the word economically, and the $400 in cash passed over a counter that Hartwell had already decided meant nothing. He didn't feel triumphant, not yet. He felt something quieter than that. He felt like a man who has opened a wall in an old house expecting to find rot and found instead the original timber, standing true, waiting to be seen again. The restoration took 11 weeks. Dr. Singh made 2 trips to Ottawa. She refused to transport the instrument until its condition was stable, and Harlan assisted her with every aspect of the work that his hands could be trusted with. The disassembly, the cleaning of the action components, the careful removal and reattachment of loose veneer, the preparation of the cabinet for refinishing. He learned more about piano mechanics in those 11 weeks than he had expected to want to know. He discovered that the design of a Broadwood action from this period was, in its own way, a feat of engineering, precise, intentional. The tolerances finer than you'd expect from 1866. Roz came to the shop on weekends and watched. She was not always patient, but she was always present, and sometimes she sat on an overturned milk crate and drew pictures of what the piano would look like when it was finished, in colored pencil, with the accuracy of a child who is paying close attention to the world. When the restoration was complete, Dr. Singh played it. She played it for 15 minutes without stopping, the way you play something you have been waiting a long time to hear. When she finished, she sat for a moment, with her hands still on the keys, and then she said, very quietly, "It sounds exactly like it should." The auction was arranged through Sotheby's Canada, in partnership with the Canadian Museum of History. The provenance documentation, the Broadwood Commission records, the library and archives letters, the Drummond estate connection, was submitted and reviewed and authenticated by 2 independent experts, each of whom produced a written assessment. The pre-sale estimate, published in the auction catalog, was set at $2 to $4 million. It sold for $4.8 million. The buyer was a private collector, a foundation dedicated to preserving Canadian cultural heritage. There was a condition attached to the sale, proposed by Harlan and accepted without objection. The piano would be made available for public exhibition at the Canadian Museum of History for a minimum of 6 months of every year, indefinitely. He thought Claire would have liked that. He thought about her sometimes when he made decisions that felt larger than the ordinary decisions of his ordinary life. And he found, in those moments, that thinking about her was not the wound it had once been. It had become something closer to a compass. The morning after the auction, a woman called his shop. She introduced herself as Marion Voss. She worked with a heritage foundation that had been trying, unsuccessfully, for years to locate and restore significant Canadian cultural artifacts that had slipped out of institutional hands into private ones. Estates, storage units, shops. She had read about the Broadwood sale in the Globe. She told him, without preamble, that she thought his skills, the combination of mechanical restoration expertise, research tenacity, and the particular kind of attention he had paid to the Broadwood, were exactly what her organization needed. She asked if he would be interested in working with them on a consulting basis. Harlan looked around his shop, at the workbench, at the familiar organized mess of his life. What would that involve? He asked. Finding things that were lost, Marion Voss said, and understanding what they were. He thought about Roz, who was currently at school learning about the history of Canada, and who, when she came home, would want to hear if anyone had called about anything interesting. He thought about the Broadwood, which was now insured for more than $5 million, and which would stand in a museum and be played and heard by people whose names he would never know. He thought about a storage room on Somerset West, and a canvas tarp, and a man who had looked at his hands and decided the conversation was already over. "I'd be interested," Harlan said. He set the phone down on the workbench. Through the small window above the tool rack, the sky over Canada was the pale, flat gray of a November morning, and the maples had finished losing their leaves. And everything was quiet in the particular way that things are quiet when something is just beginning.